going to take a little bit of an aside here on temperature measurement because I've promised some folks that I would talk about two things. One is the role of amateurs in climate, because I'm an amateur, and the other is the role that kids can play since I'm presenting at my kids' school. Forget about the colors in this chart for a second. This is a map of the U.S. Historical Climate Network, and each cross is an official temperature station in the U.S. HCN. It's basically the 1,000+ U.S. stations that roll up into the global temperature number I showed you before. And a lot of these are actually still operated by amateurs. I've been to some of them. They're actually in their backyards. For decades, most of our climate data came from amateurs who would go out and they would read the temperature and read the anemometer and read the rain gauge and write down the measurements and turn them into the Weather Service. And that's how we would monitor a lot of climate. Today, most of these have been automated, but quite a few are still in people's backyards. So there's always been a strong role for amateurs, and over the last year or two there has been an amateur effort to document the condition of these weather stations, led by a guy named Anthony Watts up in California. He is a meteorologist who went out to visit a few climate stations and concluded that the installations were terrible. They were not at all what the standards book says the temperature installation should look like. One has to be careful how one sets up temperature stations to avoid biases. For example, one would prefer to have the measurement point in an open field than, say, on a patch of black asphalt or near a metal building that might reflect or radiate heat into the thermometer. So let's go back to this chart. The colors represent how much a certain area of the country has warmed or cooled over the past 100 years according to the US HCN database. And for some reason, Tucson had the most measured warming of any place in the country. I'd already talked to Anthony Watts about his project to document station conditions, so I volunteered to start by driving a couple hours down to Tucson to check the site out. Was this a quality site, or were there biases that might explain the large reported warming? This is probably the most famous photograph I will ever take because it's all over the internet. It has been in many presentations all around the world. I still see it all the time in the oddest places. It is the US HCN official temperature station in Tucson, located on the campus of the University of Arizona. I think even those inexperienced with the topic get it immediately when looking at this picture. This is a terrible location for a temperature station. Weather monitoring stations are supposed to be in natural ground, not near buildings, not near anything that could raise the temperature of the device or bias the temperatures from what would be a natural temperature. You can see it sitting in an asphalt parking lot and surrounded by buildings. The asphalt of the parking lot absorbs heat during the day and releases it at night, warming the surroundings higher than the ambient temperature. In addition, the buildings block the wind that might help mix the air. The ability of man-made structures and paving and machinery to raise temperatures in cities is called the urban heat island effect. Most of you who live in cities probably see the effects of the urban heat island every night on the news. The weather forecast will give you the evening forecast as something like low of 59 in the city, 52 in the outlying areas. Unless you live in certain parts of Hawaii, a few miles drive does not generally take you to a different climate zone. The difference in these forecasts is the urban heat island effect at work. We can travel back in time to 1900 and see what this site looked like at the turn of the century. Remember that Arizona at the time was still a territory. It wouldn't even become a state for 12 years. And we see the area was entirely rural. This is Old Main, the original building of the University of Arizona campus, not far from the location of the current temperature station. No cars, no asphalt, no buildings. And so it has gone from this to this. So are we measuring global warming, or are we measuring the growth of Tucson? After surveying the Tucson location, my son and I did a series of surveys of other Arizona locations for a 7th grade science fair project. By the way, this is a great science fair project, and the online instructions at Watts site make it really easy to do. You can see the types of installations we found. In short, they are all poorly sited stations. We found a metal building that reflected heat on one temperature station, the little white beehive-like cylinder on the pole. We found one next to an air-conditioned exhaust between two closely spaced buildings, and one in an asphalt parking lot right up against the maintenance building of a hospital. These are terrible locations that are full of biases. The NCDC handbook indicates that stations with siting problems like these likely have errors and biases as large as 5 degrees Celsius. Which raises the obvious question, how can we reliably measure a warming signal we think might be on the order of a ½ degree Celsius with an instrument that has 5 degrees Celsius error? The signal-to-noise ratio here is terrible. In 8th grade, my son did a second science fair project related to these issues of temperature measurement. We had heard from a climate alarmist that the urban heat island effect either didn't exist or was irrelevant to temperature measurement, so we attempted to measure the Phoenix urban heat island. We strapped a PVC tube to the top of the family truckster and put a small, inexpensive temperature measurement device into the tube. The device is accurate to within about a tenth of a degree Fahrenheit and can be connected to a computer to dump its data. We also carried in the car a GPS receiver that could log the data for later download to our computer. After synchronizing the clocks in the two devices, we used the timestamps to match temperatures to location. We began driving around Phoenix at night. First we started at the center of town and we drove north. Then we returned to the center and drove south. This is the data from the northbound trip. The temperature began at 52.5 degrees in the center of town. By the time we got to the outlying areas about 25 minutes later, the temperatures had dropped 7 degrees in that short drive. We wanted to make sure that the drop wouldn't be attributed to general cooling at night, so we drove the route backwards to average the temperatures and thus eliminate any background cooling trend. What we found was a 7-degree difference due to the urban heat island effect. We actually found an even larger distance driving south the next night. To wrap it back up, the professionals have done these same types of experiments too. This particular chart is from a study in California, but similar work has been done on a number of times. In California, they found that over the last 50 years, the urban thermometers showed a degree of warming, while the rural thermometers, in contrast, showed about a third of a degree of warming. So does that mean that CO2 is somehow preferentially picking on cities? Or does that mean that maybe the big city thermometers are biased by the city growing around it, and that some of what we call global warming is in fact local urban heat island growth around measurement points? And so, the conclusion is that almost certainly there has been warming, though temperatures have been flat for the last 10 or 15 years. And past warming likely has been overstated due to biases in surface temperature record, and several studies estimating that as much as half of the warming in the surface temperature record may be due to uncorrected urban biases. So the world has warmed since the Little Ice Age ended in the early 19th century. Now I'm going to ask how much of that warming is from CO2. Here's an analogy I use a lot. Take your cell phone. If you have been using it, the battery case is probably warm. In fact, one can say it is settled science that the electronics in your phone produce heat. But does that mean cell phones are the primary driver of the temperature in your room? Probably not. The air conditioning system, the weather when the door is open, our body heat, all have a lot more to do with temperature changes than does your cell phone. I'm always amazed when strong man-made global warming advocates declare that their proof is complete once you admit that CO2 and other greenhouse gases can cause some warming. But the fact of some warming is not as important as its magnitude. We are looking at investing literally trillions of dollars on CO2 abatement because of a promised catastrophe, not some minor warming. So it matters whether outside the lab and in the complex climate system of the Earth, CO2 causes a trivial amount of warming or it causes a lot. So the question with CO2 boils down to this. Is it the cell phone warming the room by just a trivial and nearly undetectable amount? Or is it CO2 more like the room's thermostat, acting as a primary driver for temperatures? To put the question more in the parlance of climate science, is the climate system temperature sensitivity to CO2 large or is it small? I'm going to discuss 3 important arguments alarmists have made to try to prove that CO2 is a substantial rather than a trivial driver of global temperatures.